Around the end of 2019, a couple of my friends had been playing Smash Bros. With the Joker DLC and decided to pick up a shared copy of Persona 5. At the time, I'd pretty much never heard of Persona, or Shin Megami Tensei for that matter. So fast forward to spring of 2020 and my city is in full lockdown mode. Online school at the time was barely an afterthought and I had an unhealthy amount of free time on my hands, so I decided to buckle in and finally get into RPG games, which at that time I'd pretty much barely thought about playing. Now I know this video is about Persona 4, but hold on for just a second, because there's a bit of a gap before I actually got that game. Around April of last year, I actually bought Persona 5 out of curiosity since my previously mentioned friends liked the game. Although, being someone who at the time had never even finished Pokemon game, I struggled to say the least. By the end of the first main dungeon, I'd pretty much dropped the game entirely, and by the summer, I'd actually sold off my PS4. Fast forward one more time to November of last year. Half a year later, I'd become a bit more seasoned in the JRPG genre, and I wanted to give Persona 5 a second chance. Although now I didn't have any chance of playing it because it was a PlayStation exclusive. This finally brings us to Persona 4 Golden. In all honesty, I don't remember how I came across the game or when I decided to buy it, but I guess I thought, if I can't play Persona 5, this must be the next best thing, and boy was that an understatement. Persona 4 Golden is a re-release of Persona 4 with added content, kinda like how Persona 5 Royal is, if you know that. For years it was notoriously trapped on the PS Vita, Sony's less than successful sequel to the PSP, although last summer, it surprisingly came to Steam in full 1080p for the first time, and this is how I first played the game. Before I actually move on to Persona 4, I obviously need to say there's going to be spoilers for the basic plot of the game throughout the video, but the stuff you really don't want to know is going to be sectioned off in a portion near the end where I go over the game's final act with my thoughts on the story's conclusion. If you haven't played the game and are planning on it, I'll put timestamps in the description and the comments so you can skip the spoiler-heavy stuff. Also, a quick thank you to Crash Star Gaming on YouTube who let me use their footage for the background since I don't really feel like spending another 50 hours playing through the game again just to make this video. Now, actually getting into the game, when Persona 4 starts, the first thing we do is meet the protagonist of the game, canonically named Yu Narukami, but the player can do whatever they want, and his uncle Ryotaro Dojima. He explains that your parents have shipped you off from the big city to stay with your family in the small Japanese town of Inaba for 1 year while they work overseas. Here you also meet another important character, the protagonist's younger cousin Nanako. This opening is a pretty major contrast from how Persona 5 starts if you know that game. Although I played very little of that game, it was pretty surprising to play a Persona game where the protagonist wasn't immediately treated like a dangerous criminal by everyone they met. After a bit of dialogue, you get into your uncle's car and drive over to the local gas station to fill up before going home. Here's the first major occurrence of the game. While Dojima and your cousin are both off-screen, the gas station attendant walks over and strikes up a conversation with the protagonist, offering him a part-time job at the gas station. At the end of this exchange, the two shake hands before the attendant leaves to get back to work. Immediately afterwards, the protagonist gets a major headache and the player is allowed to take a walk around town before returning back home with Dojima. This is pretty much just an excuse to get acquainted with the stores and stuff in town that you're going to be shopping at for the rest of the entire game, but there's an actual reason for this sequence that I'll get into later, so hold on to that in the back of your mind. Soon enough the next day starts. It's the protagonist's first day at his new school and all seems to go well until your homeroom teacher is forced to leave for an emergency faculty meeting, and quickly after that all the students are told to go home. Somebody over the intercom announces that there's been an incident within the school zone and that police officers have been dispatched. As you go to leave the school, the player is introduced to a few classmates, Chie Satonaka, Yukiko Amagi, and Yosuke Hanamura. These three make up the protagonist's close group of friends throughout the game, and they're the first three party members you get when you actually get into the dungeon crawling and fighting part of the game. The protagonist is invited to walk home with the group of friends, and after they leave the school grounds, they come across the scene of the incident we mentioned earlier and are greeted by Dojima, who turns out to be a detective at the local police department. We're also introduced to one more character as the protagonist and company are told to go home, Dojima's fellow detective Toru Adachi, who immediately runs off screen to throw up after seeing the crime scene. Shortly after, the group of students disperse to go home, and so does the player. Later that night, a TV report goes over the incident from that day, explaining that a dead woman was found near the local river, and that the said victim was a local TV announcer who was established as missing on a TV announcement earlier in the game. The last bit of information we get from this report is a disturbing one. The victim was found hanging from a large TV antenna on a local resident's roof. When the next morning comes, we get a proper introduction to Yosuke Hanamura, who is the mandatory best friend character for Persona 4, who gets stuck in a trash can after a bike accident on the way to school. After class that day, he takes Chie and the protagonist to the local food court as a way of saying thanks for helping him out that morning. This is where we learn about the local rumor of the Midnight Channel, an urban legend that says you can see the image of your soulmate if you look into a powered-off TV exactly at midnight when it's raining. At first, Yosuke brushes it off as a childish rumor, but the protagonist agrees to try it out that night, and later that evening, after another TV report on the murder incident, the protagonist heads to his room to try out the Midnight Channel rumor. When the clock strikes 12, the protagonist is suddenly shaken by a headache similar to the one they had at the gas station earlier in the game, before trying to touch the TV in front of him. To his surprise, his hand passes directly through the screen. The next day at school, you discuss the rumor again with Yosuke and Chie, realizing that the three of you all saw the same girl appear on the TV the night prior. The two don't believe your story about putting your hand into the TV, but jokingly invite you to the local department store to check out the new flat screens that are, quote, big enough for you to fit into. And big shocker, the trio all manage to fall into the largest TV on display in the store, ending up in a strange, foggy yellow area inside the TV. Also, editor's note here, before this whole intro sequence, there's a small bit where you name your character and are introduced to Igor in the Velvet Room, which I'm not really going to talk about him much, but he's referenced later on, so you'll know who that is. Later in the game, he ends up being more of a gameplay mechanic than a character, so I'll just let it speak for itself. I just think you should know who he is before going forward. While looking for a way out, all you can find is a strange replica of a bedroom with ripped posters and blood on the wall, as well as what looks like a noose made out of rope and a red scarf. This room doesn't mean much now, but it'll be important in the endgame, so keep it in the back of your mind if you're going to watch that part of the video. Going back to where they started, the protagonist and his friends meet Persona 4's most annoying character, Teddy, although for now all he does is open a door and allow them to go back to the real world. Back in the Junes department store, the group quickly realized that the ripped-up posters you saw in the TV world were actually images of the same TV reporter that was found dead a couple days prior. The next day is probably the biggest one yet for the story. Right off the bat, another body is found just like the reporter who was killed at the very beginning of the game. This time it's different though. The victim is Saki Konishi, a third year at the protagonist's school who Yosuke knew pretty well. To add some perspective, she apparently was also the person who discovered the dead reporter's body at the beginning of the game, and she was later interviewed on TV. After school we meet with Yosuke and Chie again, who come to the eerie revelation that Konishi was the girl they both saw on the supposed Midnight Channel, mere days before she was found dead. Yosuke decides he's going to get to the bottom of things and enters the TV again, bringing the protagonist with him. Upon re-entering the foggy TV world, the two of you once again encounter the strange red mascot bear who actually accuses you of being the perpetrators of the murder, as he states somebody was throwing people into his home, this TV dimension. The protagonist recalls Igor's words from the very beginning of the game about entering a contract. This is when you agree to help Teddy in finding the culprit to these murders. He leads the player and Yosuke to what looks like a mirror copy of Inaba's shopping district and explains that it's one of the many, quote, weird places that have been appearing inside the TV world as of late. To search for clues, you come to the mirror image of Saki Kanishi's family liquor store, and I think I'll let this scene speak for itself.
Huh?
And call forth what is within.
So
This awakening of the player's persona leads to the first battle of the game, which is pretty much a tutorial, so I'm going to hold off on talking about the gameplay mechanics until I get to that part of the video. But I think it's important to explain for now what a persona is. In the game series, a persona is basically the manifestation of someone's true feelings that can be weaponized against the enemies called shadows. These are just the demons from the overarching Megami Tensei series, but they have a different name here. After killing some pushover enemies, the protagonist is introduced to his persona, Izanagi. After Yosuke and Teddy gush about how cool and powerful you are for a minute, you finally get to enter the TV ROM's copy of the liquor shop. Inside, we hear the ghostly voice of the late Saki Konishi reveal her true feelings about Yosuke and how she secretly hated him and was only nice because his dad was her boss at the local department store. The camera pans over to show us Shadow Yosuke, who embodies all of his worst aspects. After getting fed up with his rudeness and general ignorance, the real Yosuke says those fateful words, "You're not me," causing the Shadow to morph into the first kind of boss in the game. After defeating him, Yosuke recognizes his true self and obtains his own persona. After this tiresome day, Teddy helps the two of you get back to the real world, but before going to bed you catch one more TV news broadcast where your classmate Yukiko is being interviewed about her family's famous inn. After seeing this, the protagonist decides to watch the Midnight Channel again, where a familiar silhouette is seen. Obviously, the next day the trio of friends decide to watch the Midnight Channel again, where we see Yukiko set up in what looks like a low-budget TV show. As soon as the broadcast ends, you get a call from Yosuke, who agrees to meet up with you the next morning to investigate. This meetup with Yosuke doesn't go exactly as planned though, leading to the two of you getting brought into the police department for waving around swords in public. Dojima tells you off for being irresponsible and sticking your noses in a police investigation, but before you leave, his fellow detective Adachi accidentally lets a bit of information slip about the case, in particular the fact that Yukiko has also gone missing. Later that day, you meet up again with Yosuke and Chie, all planning to enter the TV world to search for your missing classmate, and with the power of Teddy's bear nose, he leads you to the castle you saw last night on the Midnight Channel. Chie immediately runs off into the castle to search for her friend, so you and Yosuke follow suit to make sure both of them are safe. To put it plainly, this is the first of many dungeons in the game where the bulk of the actual gameplay takes place. I'll go through this pretty quickly so I can wrap up the introduction of the story and actually talk about my experience with the game. The player and Yosuke go through floors of this castle fighting shadows and regular turn-based combat. This is also where the protagonist can recruit new personas with different abilities that can be switched out in battle. A few floors in, you find Chie confronting her shadow self, which morphs into another mini-boss, afterwards giving her the power of persona and allowing her to join the player's party. After this, the group returns to the entrance of the Shadow World, where the investigation team is officially born with you as its leader. The group agrees to enter the TV as often as possible to make progress on rescuing Yukiko and solving the mystery. This is also when it's established that those trapped in the TV are usually found dead after days of heavy rain and fog, giving the player a time limit of sorts. You can come and go from the dungeons as much as you want, but it can pretty easily be completed in one in-game day. When you reach the end, you can find Yukiko with her shadow self, which ensues another boss with her getting her persona after it's beaten. Once this is over, that's pretty much done with the long tutorial of the game, which makes up the first 5 hours or so, which is pretty long. This person goes missing, gets rescued from the TV world, gets a persona, and becomes a party member cycle is what makes up the majority of the game, so I'll stop parroting the plot synopsis for now and actually talk about what Persona 4 has to offer. Since Persona 3 was released in 2006, the series has had a pretty unique identity as a weird hybrid of RPG and life simulator games. In Persona 4, there's 2 main things you'll be doing throughout the game. The first is fighting shadows and bosses in turn-based combat, and the other is managing your time and relationships as a regular high school sophomore. That means you'll have to balance out hanging out with friends and working and doing other tasks around town to pass the time. If I'm being 100% honest, I am really not a fan of this system, just because of how often you end up speeding through the days, doing as little as possible so you can actually progress the story. But the way you manage your time can be rewarding in different ways, which makes it kind of worth it in the end. There are a lot of things to talk about in the gameplay department, so I'm going to take it all one at a time by starting with the combat, which makes up the bulk of the game. In Persona 4's dungeons, you'll be fighting against shadows using the power of Persona. Each character has one with its own strengths and weaknesses, while the protagonist in any given game has the ability of the wild card, meaning they can harness and use any number of personas rather than being restricted to just one. When you get into the actual turn-based fighting of the game, it can be best compared to something like Pokemon, with elemental strengths and weaknesses being the big thing to look out for. Each element has its own name in Persona, and most of them are the same as in the overarching Megami Tensei series. For Persona 4, you can expect fire, ice, wind, and electric attacks, as well as some special ones like light and dark, which kill enemies in one hit while having low accuracy, and almighty attacks, which have a very high SP cost but do large amounts of damage regardless of enemy strength and weaknesses. There's also healing moves, ailment moves, and by far the most important, stat buffs and debuffs. If you're unfamiliar with the Megami Tensei franchise, you might think of stat-changing moves as something kind of useful but not crucial, kind of like they are in Pokemon, for example, but in this series they can make or break a battle. The one thing that might take the most adjustment for newcomers to the series is the excessive use of moves that change your team's stats by raising or lowering defense, same for your enemy, or with your attack power and accuracy, and so on. The key to playing Persona, or any Megami Tensei game for that matter, is to take advantage of these support moves as well as exploiting your enemy's elemental weakness. That takes us to Persona's signature combat mechanic, the one more system. This means if you hit an enemy with an attack it's weak to, you can do one more before your turn passes on to the next party member, allowing you to double down on the damage you deal, or use it to heal your partners and raise your team's stats. I used to find turn-based battles in games tedious and annoying, but the depth and opportunity for strategy in this game is the reason I kept coming back for the whole 55-hour runtime. This system isn't without its flaws, though, as every major boss in the later half of the game straight up doesn't have weaknesses at all, which kind of takes the purpose out of having elemental moves outside of random encounters, which is pretty annoying. In main series Megami Tensei games, that's not really a problem, at least with what I've played, so in Persona it gets kind of annoying when later in the game a lot of the bosses are just damage sponges where you're doing whatever attack you can land until they die. Overall though, the turn-based fighting mechanics in Persona 4 are genuinely a blast while still putting up some challenge, especially if you went into most of the dungeons of the game under-leveled like I did. One more thing to mention, which is signature to the Megami Tensei franchise, is the fusion system. I mentioned before that the protagonist can have multiple personas. These are acquired through a little card shuffling minigame that takes place after random encounters, which I won't really get into. To put it simply, you can collect personas with different abilities and use Igor's Velvet Room to fuse them together in pairs of 2, or even groups of 3 or 4 or 5, creating new and more powerful personas for your team. This is incredibly useful, and it's the main way you'll be getting new personas throughout the game, because the ones you casually pick up while in dungeons are usually underleveled and have an incomplete moveset. Persona 4 has 9 main dungeons that you're going to be going through throughout the year the game takes place in, although 2 of these are completely optional, and you'll want to complete them if you want to get the best ending. The dungeons each have a distinct theme and design, but it's pretty obvious that they follow a very similar pattern of hallways and doors and rooms with staircases. In all of these dungeons, the objective is to scale a number of floors while fighting shadows and occasionally solving small puzzles so you can eventually reach the top where the big boss awaits. What's a bit unique about Persona 4 though is the fact that in almost every dungeon, you're working to save the local serial killer's next possible victim who's been trapped inside the TV world. What makes this special is that the conclusion of each dungeon usually results in the victim accepting their shadow and gaining the power of Persona, giving you an additional party member and a new character in the investigation team. As you progress through the game, you slowly get new options for strategy as each party member has their own strengths and weaknesses and specialties, like Yosuke being a powerful wind-type magic attacker, and Chie being one of the hardest-hitting physical damage dealers in the game, as well as specializing in ice magic. I think now is a good time to move on to the other half of the gameplay you'll get in Persona games, the weird life simulator stuff. I've said it before and I'll say it again, I'm not really into this. A lot of it, especially in the later half of the game, ends up being really tedious and even boring for long stretches of times. My biggest gripe with this is the fact that when you finish a dungeon, you still have to pass the days and wait for its deadline to pass so the story can continue at its set pace. This means that if you rush through the dungeons in 1 or 2 days each like most people do, you'll get stuck spending up to an hour or two passing the time afterwards to actually see where the story goes next. Now, I've complained about this probably more than I should have, but I do need to talk about what this life simulator portion of the game actually entails, because obviously just because something isn't for me doesn't mean it won't be great for others. And the reward for participating in the protagonist's daily life is actually a major deal when it comes to playing the game. When you aren't actively kicking ass and shuffling cards in Persona 4's dungeons, you'll be living out the protagonist's day-to-day life. You have to go to class, work or study at night, drive a motorbike around to visit places outside of town, and most importantly, spend afternoons and weekends with other people to raise your social links. The social link system is another thing that makes the Persona series pretty unique. Every major character plus some extras has their own social link, a level that you increase by spending time with them. There's a lot to dig into here, so I'm going to go over the basics of what a social link actually is, and then introduce the full cast of the game before talking about the links I focused on during my playthrough. To start off, the most basic reward for participating in a social link is through the Arcana system. If you remember before, I briefly mentioned the Persona Fusion service that Igor provides out of the Velvet Room. Every Persona has an Arcana, which is a tarot card it represents, and each social link also represents one of these Arcana. This means that, for example, if you've reached level 5 in the social link of the Fool Arcana, you'll get an XP bonus whenever you fuse a Persona of the same one. It seems like a small feature, but if you have a specific social link at max level, which is 10, it can level up a new Persona you use multiple times before you even start using it, which is a huge deal for learning new skills in the later half of the game. The social link system offers far more than just this, though. Specifically, every member of the investigation team has their own character arc that can be seen throughout their social links. And as you progress through each one, the character you spend time with gains extra skills and abilities that can be used in battle, which are incredibly useful, like allowing certain party members to withstand mortal blows with 1 HP, or learn incredibly useful support moves. Outside of tangible benefits like these, it's also kinda nice to see the character development with your party members and other characters through these social links. So before I go any further into it, I think it'll be useful if I go ahead and properly introduce each of the major characters, especially in the investigation team. And then I'll go a bit more in depth with the social links I actually did throughout my playthrough of the game. First off, we have the protagonist's uncle, Dojima, and his daughter, Nanako, both of which have their own social links which are the most easily accessible since you can consistently find them at home on most days. Next is Yosuke, Chie, and Yukiko, who are the main characters' starting friend group, and the first people to start the investigation team. I'll go ahead and introduce the other members of the investigation team in the order they get rescued from the TV world, starting with Kanji Tatsumi, the local leather jacket-wearing tough guy who after joining the team ends up being probably the kindest and most well-written character in the game in my opinion. Next is Rise Kujikawa, a famous pop idol who quits to come home to her family in Inaba and return to living as a normal high school student. And finally, Naoto Shirogane, the detective prince, the youngest in a long family line of detectives who enrolls at the protagonist's high school while helping out with the Inaba Police Department's investigation in the serial murder case. Teddy, for some reason, also has a social link, which actually ends up being kind of important in the later part of the game. Other social links include Igor's Velvet Room attendant Margaret, and exclusive to Persona 4 Golden is Marie, another Velvet Room attendant, as well as Dojima's detective sidekick, the cabbage-loving Adachi. If you're familiar with the game, you probably noticed I only list about half of the total social links that are available. The game has a big portion of them attached to certain jobs the player can get or certain clubs in the school, which in all honesty, I just didn't really know or care about when I played the game. I'm sure a lot of these characters have a cool bit of story behind them, but I can really only focus on the ones I'm familiar with. Getting back on the main topic, I really wanted to delve into some of the character arcs with the social links I focused on in my playthrough. First off, I think obviously one of the most important in the game is Yosuke's, because he's the protagonist's best bro and the first social link you actually start in the game. His character arc revolves mostly around him dealing with his insecurities and feelings after the death of Saki Kunishi, someone he looked up to who ended up actually hating him and just seeing him as an annoying younger kid. I think they did a decent job about making him grow as a character, even though his entire social link character arc is completely optional. and isn't directly connected to the progression of the game's plot. Although I do have one pretty big problem. Yosuke is just not a good person. Although they try really hard to make you sympathize with him and care about him as a character throughout his own personal arc, he's generally just not a good person throughout the main story. He's usually being pretty rude or harassing the women in the investigation team, as well as Kanji on the basis that he might be gay. Even though Yosuke is one of the big main characters in the game, they make it really hard to like him. I guess Atlus knew what they were doing when they put him in a trash can in the game's opening cutscene. The other two social links in particular I really liked and worked towards while completing the game were Dojima and Nanako. I mentioned before they were the easiest ones to progress, but their personal character arcs are also some of the best in the game, I think. To give a bit of background information on the two, both of their social links revolve around Nanako's mom, who died in a tragic hit-and-run car accident years prior to the events of Persona 4. This left Dojima as a totally unprepared single father, forcing Nanako at only 6 years old to take care of herself most of the time. We see this get even worse throughout the game, as during the serial murder investigation, Dojima increasingly has to spend late nights at the police department, even not coming home some days, giving Nanako less and less time to actually be with her family. Dojima's social link can be accessed on the nights when he actually is at home, usually drinking coffee at the dining table and reading the newspaper. The more you talk to him over time, the more he opens up to you about what actually happened with his wife, and he reveals that he spends most of his free time personally investigating the incident, desperately searching for the driver of the car that killed Nanako's mom. At the same time, Nanako's social link is her opening up about her feelings towards her parents, not really understanding the fact that her mom died, and thinking that Dojima doesn't really love her because he spends most of his time away at work instead of with his family. Both of these character arcs end with the characters accepting what happened to Nanako's mom and being able to move on. The reason why these are the two most important social links in the game to me are because the protagonist's involvement seems to actually have an effect, being a sort of bridge of communication between Dojima and his daughter to actually help them heal from the past and be a family again. Although all the social links give everybody a bit of character development, they're completely separate from the plot of the game because they can be started or finished at almost any time. Because of this, there's a much more important culmination of their character arcs later on, and that gives me the perfect segue into the next section of the video. Before I move on, I need to put a major warning here that this next section of the video will spoil almost all of the major plot events in Persona 4, focusing on the story's final act, which starts around October on the in-game calendar. There will be timestamps in the description, and I'll put one right up on the screen that'll fast forward you to the next section of the video without spoilers if you want to experience the story firsthand. So, before you get mad that I talked about the ending, you have personally been warned. Now, before we get to the ending actually, let's rewind a bit. Where we left off last time in the plot of the game, Yukiko just became the 4th Persona user in the group. Over time, the investigation team grows as more people are trapped in the TV world and rescued. Teddy gets one too eventually, and for some reason he does so many sit-ups that he becomes a human. This never really gets explained, so just go with it. Throughout the year, the investigation team gets new members with their own personas, and eventually another murder takes place fitting the description of the previous two. The victim this time is the protagonist's homeroom teacher, although when the culprit is tracked down, he's just a creepy student who killed his own teacher in an attempt to take credit for the real killer, who's still loose in Inaba. As time goes on, hope for an answer seems farther and farther away until the protagonist receives a letter in late October simply saying, "Don't rescue anymore." The investigation team decides to wait and see if this actually means anything instead of acting though. The situation doesn't change much until November 4th, when a new silhouette appears on the Midnight Channel, not yet detailed enough to identify the possible next victim though. The following day, Dojima comes home to find another letter addressed to the protagonist, saying if you don't stop this time, someone close will be put in and killed. Immediately after the player has a chance to read it, Dojima swipes the letter out of your hand and starts interrogating the player about his involvement with the serial murder case. Even if you tell him the truth, he doesn't believe a word of it and takes you into the Inaba police department for further questioning. Again, you're given the option to tell Dojima the truth about your involvement, but he still doesn't believe in the existence of personas and the world inside the TV. He tells you to stay in the police department overnight and leaves to get back to work. Meanwhile, Teddy and Yosuke call the Dojima residence and offer to bring Nanako some snacks, knowing she's likely bored and home alone, but instead they learn about the second letter and the player's predicament at the police station, so they call up the rest of the investigation team. Back in the protagonist's interrogation room, the clock strikes midnight and the old TV in the corner lights up. The next victim of the serial murders in Inaba is supposed to be Nanako. In town, the investigation team recognizes Nanako on the Midnight Channel and heads to the police station to check in the protagonist, while Naoto goes to the Dojima residence to make sure Nanako is okay. When the group arrives at the station, they barge into the interrogation room to announce that Nanako has already gone missing. Over the phone, Naoto tells Dojima that they got to the house and the front door was open, while Nanako was gone. A distressed Dojima leaves the scene to search for his daughter, leaving his detective partner Adachi to look over the members of the investigation team still at the police station. The group discusses the scene. Nanako was kidnapped with the front door of the house left open, and all the victims of the kidnappings had been almost immediately thrown into a TV, which had to be nearby. Nanako would have had to open the door for the kidnapper, who had to be someone she recognized, before being thrown into a large TV, likely stored in a large vehicle nearby. The group lands on the conclusion that the kidnapper would have to be a delivery truck driver, somebody Nanako would recognize with a large vehicle that could fit a TV inside. Adachi quickly realizes something and runs out of the room, leaving a sheaf of papers on the table. Upon reading them, the investigation team finds out that their description perfectly aligns with one of Dojima's possible suspects of the case, Taro Namatame, a former city council secretary who, before the events of Persona 4, had an affair with a certain TV announcer, the first victim of the murder cases. After the events, he resigned from his position, instead joining his family business as a delivery truck driver. Bingo. Adachi comes back into the room and lightly tells the group that he wouldn't see anything if they leave the interrogation room to actually investigate the crime. After this, we cut to a car chase in the rain, with Dojima trailing behind the suspect's delivery truck, but this doesn't go exactly as planned. Adachi and the investigation team arrive at the scene of the crash. Dojima is injured but still conscious, and an ambulance is called for him while Namatame's truck is investigated. The suspect is gone, but inside is a large flat-screen TV and a diary of sorts, explaining how he discovered the world inside the TV and planned these kidnappings in order to save people. This was alongside a list of the previous victims' home addresses. Later in the hospital, Dojima begs the protagonist to save Nanako, and the investigation team plans to start searching inside the TV world the next day. This is where we're introduced to Nanako's dungeon, Heaven. After reaching the top of the game's seemingly final dungeon, the investigation team confronts Namatame, who recognizes many of the group's members, and explains how he throws people into the TV to save them after seeing them appear on the Midnight Channel. After Namatame's shadow threatens to kill Nanako, the group shoves him away in order to save her, and he transforms into the dungeon's final boss, Kunino Sagiri. After one of the toughest battles in the whole game, Namatame reverts to his normal self and collapses on the ground, so the investigation team carries both of them back out to the real world to get another ambulance. After the two of them are hospitalized and Namatame is detained by the police, Dojima and Adachi thank the protagonist for his help, and the investigation team decides that all they can do is wait for conditions to improve, so time passed. Later in the month, Adachi comes to the group with news that Nanako has gotten better enough to have visitors in the hospital, as well as Namatame giving a full confession to his crimes. At the same time, however, a thick fog begins to cover Inaba, and later that day, the group visits Dojima and Nanako in the hospital, where we learn the doctors aren't able to find the cause of Nanako's symptoms, and are unsure how stable her condition will be going forward. In town, the fog continues to roll in, causing concern about health problems and rumors about it even being poisonous, causing some people to start wearing gas masks outside. On the morning of December 3rd, the group comes to a strange realization. While you're in the TV world, the investigation team has to wear special glasses made by Teddy to see through the fog and navigate. These glasses now work on the fog covering Inaba, raising the idea that it could be leaking into the real world from some place inside the TV. After this discovery, the group decides to meet at Junes after school that day. As soon as class ends, the player is met with a prompt. There will be dramatic turns in the story from this point. It's strongly recommended that you take the opportunity to save. Would you like to save your game now? And, to put it lightly, this is where shit starts to get real. After school, the group drops the conversation about the fog and instead decides to go into Junes to buy a gift for Nanako while she's still stuck in the hospital. While the group is deciding what to get her, the protagonist suddenly gets a call from Adachi. He says that Nanako's condition suddenly got worse and that you all need to get to the hospital immediately. The whole investigation team arrives at the hospital full of commotion, and in Nanako's room, Dojima begs the doctors to save her before everyone is asked to leave. Outside, Adachi joins the group with some more bad news. Namatame apparently now has an alibi for the first case, and they're not sure if they can actually get him charged with being the murderer in court, but this is quickly interrupted by a nurse hastily telling the protagonist that he needs to come back to Nanako's hospital room.
What the hell? What's going on?
No. Nanako-chan. Daddy.
Nanako-chan. Nanako-chan. Can you hear us? Do you understand what we're saying? Your big brother's here with you. Just hang in there. Where's Dojima-san?
We're calling for him right now.
How's Nanako?
Doctor.
Big bro. I'm scared. Big bro. Daddy.
Nanako! Nanako!
I'm sorry, sir.
Damn it! Damn it!
Nana-chan.
Dojima leaves and makes his way to Namatame's hospital room, but is stopped by police guards who usher him away to his own bed, giving the investigation team the opportunity to enter. Namatame sits on the ground confused as the Midnight Channel brings the hospital room's TV to life. This reveals Namatame's shadow still in the TV world, explaining how he failed to save Nanako, but will still get away with everything in court. All the while, the real Namatame seemingly has no idea what's going on. This is probably the most important moment in the entire game, and where the story branches off into 3 very different endings, 2 of them being bad endings. Most people, including me, usually get unlucky on the first try, but if you choose the right dialogue options, you can convince the group to calm down and wait to hear Namatame's side of the story. At this point, the investigation team's social link is automatically completed and a new one is started, Seekers of Truth. After this, the group returns to Nanako's hospital room for one more twist. She's somehow still alive, although Teddy has now gone missing, returning to the TV world alone after believing he somehow broke his promise to protect Nanako. The next day, the group convenes at the Junes food court again, with Teddy still nowhere to be seen. They go over the facts of the case up until this point and find a couple inconsistencies. When Namatame found out that Nanako supposedly died, he said that he failed to save her, meaning this saving he does by throwing people into the TV isn't meant to kill them. Even more suspicious is the warning letter the protagonist got, saying if he didn't stop rescuing people from the TV world, someone close would be put in and killed. If Namatame's objective wasn't to kill people in the TV world, somebody else would have had to write that letter. Later that same day, the group arrives at Namatame's hospital room to question him, and he explains his side of the story. After his affair with the announcer went public, he moved in with his parents to run away from the scandal and started drinking heavily. This is when he started seeing people appear on the Midnight Channel and discovered his ability to reach inside the TV. After being unable to save the first two victims of the murder case, he came to the conclusion that people who appeared inside the Midnight Channel needed to go inside the TV so the true culprit couldn't reach them. When he tried to tell the police what was going on, they didn't listen, so Namatame took matters into his own hands. Because the investigation team had rescued everybody after Saki who ended up in the TV world, Namatame thought what he did was working and continued with his mission to save people. It wasn't until he entered the TV world himself with Nanako when he discovered the dangerous place he'd been putting people into this whole time. And with that, the Seekers of Truth come to the conclusion that another person had to be behind the killings of the first two victims. The real murderer is still out there. The next day, the group convenes at a local restaurant after failing to get more information about the true culprit around town. After eating, the protagonist, Naoto, and Yosuke step outside to get some fresh air, and the player is prompted to choose who they think the murderer truly is. It has to be someone who could get around the police department without being suspicious, and someone who knew Dojima's address to deliver the warning letters personally. Only one person fits the description perfectly: Dojima's sidekick detective, Toru Adachi. The three of them go back inside to join the rest of the group and express their suspicion about Adachi, where we learn that he was assigned to guard the TV announcer's room at the local inn when she was in town, the same inn where she went missing and was later found dead. Apparently, he had brought Saki Konishi, the second victim, into the police department on multiple occasions for questioning. The Seekers of Truth decide to confront Adachi at the hospital while he's there for Namatame's relocation. Later that evening, we find an anxious-sounding Adachi in the hallway of the hospital, and Dojima arrives too, asking about Namatame's relocation. He expresses his concern about the first two murders and gets mad at Adachi for having Namatame relocated before he could be fully questioned. A confused Dojima watches as his fellow detective gets increasingly angry and nervous about being questioned. The longer you talk to Adachi, the more inconsistencies start to crop up, obviously him lying about how much he knows surrounding the first two victims. This is when he starts to slip up. The protagonist asks about the warning letters, which he says he knows nothing about, until Dojima butts in to say that he was supposed to take the second letter into the crime lab for processing. Here, Kanji finally accuses Adachi of being their culprit, and in response he says he knows Namatame isn't the one who, quote, put them all in. This is Adachi's biggest and final mistake. The only way he could know about people being put into the TV is if he was involved. Adachi runs off after being confronted, leading the Seekers of Truth to a vacant hospital room where they only find a large flat-screen TV. At this point, it's pretty obvious where he went. That night when the protagonist goes to sleep, he wakes up in the Velvet Room to find only Teddy inside, seemingly also summoned in his sleep. Here you can tell him what actually happened and how Nanako survived her ordeal at the hospital, and his social link is automatically completed. This part is kinda weird and it's never really explained, but it's an excuse for Teddy to get brought back into the main cast. The next day he appears back in the real world and rejoins the Seekers of Truth at Junes. On December 7th, the reunited group begin their search for Adachi in the TV world, which leads them back to the room that Chie, Yosuke, and the protagonist found at the very beginning of the game. This is where they find Adachi surrounded by the ripped-up posters featuring the first victim of the murder case. Here he explains how he discovered the power to reach inside the TV and used it to dispose of people he didn't like, simply because he could. We also learned that Adachi was on the other side of the phone when Namatame called the police about saving people on the Midnight Channel being murdered, and Adachi was the one who convinced him to start saving people in the first place. After this confession of sorts, Adachi explains how the fog from the TV world is leaking over into Inaba, slowly merging the two worlds and putting the entire population of the town in danger. The next day you get access to the dungeon Magatsu Inaba, where Adachi awaits. At the top of the dungeon, you finally battle Adachi after a monologue about society and murdering people just because he was bored. He's a bit of a pushover, and beating him gives way to the true final boss of the dungeon. A defeated Adachi transforms into Amino Sagiri, the creator of the fog threatening to take over Inaba. After defeating what seems again like Persona 4's final boss, Amino Sagiri agrees to lift the fog covering Inaba, and Adachi returns to his normal self, being taken into police custody back in the real world. In town, the Seekers of Truth social link is completed, and the group celebrates the mystery finally being solved. And there we go. After about 4 whole pages of heavy spoilers in the script I'm writing, Persona 4 is finally over. Or at least you would think so if you were playing the original version on PlayStation 2, where the game immediately fast-forwards to the protagonist's last day in Inaba after beating that final boss. But in Persona 4 Golden, the time just keeps moving on, making it obvious that this isn't really the end. As time passes, Nanako recovers enough to come home for Christmas, and Dojima gets better too. There's some nice events on the holidays, and the Midnight Channel seems to stop showing up altogether. Later on in early February, the friend group goes on a skiing trip where we get access to Persona 4 Golden's exclusive dungeon, the Hollow Forest. This dungeon revolves around the character Marie, one of the Velvet Room attendants whose social link I never actually started in my playthrough, so I personally never played this dungeon. All I know is that you need to do it to get the special little epilogue in the best ending of the game, which I'll get to in a bit. After Valentine's Day, the calendar fast-forwards to March 20th, the day before Yu Narukami has to leave Inaba and go home. This last day gives you a chance to say goodbye to all the social links you've completed throughout the game, and at the end it prompts you to go back to the Dojima residence and, quote, get ready for tomorrow. If you go through with this, you get the game's basic good ending, where the mystery is solved and Adachi is in jail, so the protagonist can rest easy knowing his friends in Inaba are safe and he can come back to visit whenever he wants. On the other hand, you can refuse to go home on March 20th and instead go to the Junes food court, where you find the rest of the Seekers of Truth. The group gets some food and talks a bit on their last day all living together in Inaba. You get on the conversation topic of the Midnight Channel, and everybody starts to wonder where the rumor originated from, and here the protagonist realizes he was able to enter the TV before awakening his persona ability. He also remembers a letter he received that morning and reads it to the group. The letter is from Adachi in jail, and he explains how he and Namatame both gained their power to enter the TV after coming to Inaba, and he thinks that has something to do with the origin of the Midnight Channel. The group contemplates this and comes to the conclusion that even though Adachi was the culprit behind the murders, there has to be another conductor of sorts behind the existence of the Midnight Channel. The group goes out into town one last time to investigate, and the player is prompted to find the initial spark of the protagonist's power. More specifically, the first person he met in town. If you remember the very beginning of Persona 4, in the introduction of the game, there was a weird sequence where the protagonist shook the hand of a gas station attendant, which gave him a headache. Upon returning to this gas station and confronting the same attendant, he reveals himself to be the human form of Izanami, Persona 4's true final boss. After convening with the Seekers of Truth one last time, you venture into the TV world with only one day to complete the game's final dungeon, Yomotsu Hirasaka. Upon reaching the 9th floor of this dungeon, you can finally fight the true form of Izanami and a final boss that's surprisingly not the hardest in the game, although the fight does drag on for a long time. At the end, in a scripted sequence, the player's entire party is defeated, although the protagonist hears the voices of everybody he met in the past year and is able to recover, evolving his persona into its true form. After the player is revived in battle, Izanami realizes that the player can no longer be defeated, and you're given the opportunity to use a new ability called Myriad Truths, destroying Izanami and the Midnight Channel forever.
This can't be. How could I be defeated? How am I the one to disappear? Instead of the endless struggle, wouldn't it be easier to wrap oneself in lies and live in blissful ignorance? Isn't that true peace for humans?
How many times do we have to tell you? The hell with that shit!
Stop assuming you know us!
Very well. Then try and live your way. Power enough to erase my existence. You have already exceeded what I thought humanity to be capable of. You have lifted the fog in this world, as well as the fog in your own. And whether that will lead to happiness or not, rests upon your shoulders. Children of man, well done.
All right, we did it!
Thank goodness.
It's really over now.
Yep, this time it's all over!
It seems this is more like a beginning for us, though.
Well, now we've got no regrets for tomorrow.
This turns the TV world back into its original form, which looks a lot like Earth with lots of grass and sunlight and lakes. The next day, the protagonist really does have to go home, though, saying goodbye to your friends and family at the train station before getting back on board. And with that, Persona 4 is actually over. If you completed the extra dungeons, though, you do get a little reward in the form of an epilogue cutscene where the protagonist comes back to Inaba to visit next summer. You get to see everybody you got to know throughout the game, including Kanji, who looks like an entirely different person. The former investigation team, along with Dojima and Nanako, have a surprise party for the protagonist's return, and then the credits finally roll. Persona 4 has probably been one of my favorite stories ever in a game. I would even say it's one of my favorite stories ever told, up there with things like the Xenoblade Chronicles games and Homestuck. A lot of people say that Persona 4 has the best cast of characters in the series, and I'd have to agree 100%. Even though I only started it because I didn't have the means to play Persona 5, it ended up being one of my favorite games of all time. The best part for me is that because I haven't had the chance to complete all the extra content in the game, I have the perfect excuse to go for a new Game Plus run in the future. I finished the game in early January, and I've been working on this video since then, but because I like P4 so much, I actually ended up procrastinating quite a lot to play more games in the Persona and Shin Megami Tensei series. When I finished Persona 4, the first instinct I had was to start the game over and play the whole thing again. I didn't end up doing that, but instead I sat down and binged the entirety of Persona 3 Portable, as well as Shin Megami Tensei 4, both Law and Chaos Roots, as well as Devil Summoner Soul Hackers, and a few other SMT games that I dabbled in a bit. Although Persona 4 is still one of my favorite games, getting further into the franchise has given me a bit of a different perspective on Persona. First of all, what I immediately did after finishing Persona 4 was buy a cheap modded PSP to play the previous game in the series, and I completed the whole thing in about a week. Persona 3 has pretty similar elements, using a slightly more primitive version of the social link system, and having personas and fighting shadows, and Igor in the Velvet Room being functionally the same. The original release of Persona 3 on the PS2 actually used the same engine as Persona 4, which came out only 2 years later. I won't get too far into Persona 3 since I'd love to make a video about it someday in the future, but I still think it's worthwhile to compare it to Persona 4 since I went into P3 expecting it to feel very outdated and old in comparison. Persona 3, in all honesty, might have a better story than Persona 4. Not better characters, but a better plot and conclusion. After finishing the game, I was in a tough spot because I was still trying to write this video, but I liked Persona 3 so much that I contemplated scratching it and making something on that game instead, or maybe even turning this video into a combination of something on Persona 3 and Persona 4. Although if you're looking at the length of this video, you can probably guess why I didn't do that. They're both great games, and I don't think I'll ever be able to pick one over the other, but if you play Persona 3 or Persona 4, you might as well play both. After finishing Persona 3 though, I decided to step up and finally play a real SMT game, and I have to admit, it was probably the most fun I've had with a turn-based RPG in a really long time. Although the Persona games are more known for their great stories, the Shin Megami Tensei franchise they're based off of is so much better in my opinion. While Persona games are usually half fighting and half life simulator, SMT games are the fighting part with no filler at all. In most Shin Megami Tensei games, you'll be going through a string of progressively harder dungeons while recruiting, fusing, and fighting demons. The personas you collect throughout the Persona games are just demons from SMT with a different name on them. While Persona uses the one more system for turn-based battle, mainline SMT games use something a little different called the press turn system. When you start your turn in a battle, you're given a number of icons that reflect how many members your party currently has. This represents the amount of moves you get to make before your turn ends. What makes the press turn system so unique is the use of enemy weaknesses. When you attack an enemy in a way that exploits its weakness or get a critical hit, you only use half an icon rather than a full one. This means if you successfully attack your enemy's weak point, you can double the number of actions taken in any given turn, and the enemy can do exactly the same thing to you. The press turn system, along with Shin Megami Tensei's reliance on support moves to not die in one hit, adds so much depth and strategy to a simple turn-based battle system. On top of that, Shin Megami Tensei 4 is mostly made up of a long series of bosses as you progress through the game, meaning you're constantly coming up with new ways to set up your team and strategize for the next big enemy. Although I had so much more fun playing Shin Megami Tensei than I did Persona, I think both series are relatively just as good as each other, only having different strengths, and this brings me to the big question of the video. To answer right off the bat, the short answer is obviously yes, but it's really not that simple. Persona games aren't for everyone, and in all honesty, I'm not even really into the whole life simulator aspect of the games I've played. I think games like Persona 4 are really easy to give up on just because of how long the runtime is and how much sitting around and waiting the game has. It took me about 50 hours to complete Persona 4, and only about half of those were spent actively in dungeons. Shin Megami Tensei 4, on the other hand, took me 25 hours to beat, and the whole game was made up of non-stop fighting. Most people like to point out that Persona games act as a good entry point to the Megami Tensei franchise because of them being generally easier, but I can't say I agree at all. Sure, Persona might be easier, but the amount of filler and sitting around it has makes it a bit harder to get into in my opinion. I think the best thing I can really say is that I recommend Persona 4 to anybody willing to put in the time to experience the story. But even if you're not sure, the game is $20 on Steam and it frequently goes on sale, so I'd say it's worth giving a shot regardless. Shin Megami Tensei, on the other hand, is probably worth trying for people who have a little experience in RPGs or play a lot of the genre. I think SMT4 is a good starting point because it's known to be easier than the other games in the series. If you're looking for more of a challenge though, the Switch recently got an HD remaster of Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, which is probably the most well-known game in the series. The remaster launched last October in Japan and is coming to North America during a vague spring 2021 release window. And an update, this script was written before the release date was announced. It comes out May 25th for those interested, and I'm definitely buying it day one. Shin Megami Tensei 5 is also supposed to come out sometime this year, so that's another game to look forward to. Although I have my complaints, Persona 4 is definitely a masterpiece, and I think everybody willing to give it a chance should pick it up on Steam. Until Persona 5 hopefully makes it to platforms other than the PlayStation, P4 will be the most accessible entry point in the series, and honestly I think that's a good thing, because Persona 4 perfectly embodies everything the series is known for. And hey, if you go out and play Persona 4 and like it, there's also a fighting game, a dancing game, and a 3DS spin-off including the cast of Persona 3 that, for some reason, all canonically happen in the same universe as the original. Persona 4 even got 2 animated series based off the game that are genuinely pretty funny from what clips I've seen, and I don't even like anime. Persona 5's massive popularity in the past 2 years has really shown there's potential for the Megami Tensei franchise to make it big outside of Japan, and I have a feeling a lot of people watching this only clicked on it because they know about or have played Persona 5. All I can say to you guys is this: please give Persona 4 a chance. It's been one of the wildest rides I've ever taken in a video game, and I think anyone who liked Persona 5 will feel the same about Persona 4. Thank you. Alright, and now that's finally done, I'm just making a little unscripted bit at the end of the video to clear up a few questions you guys might have. I know I haven't uploaded in like over 4 months, which is a really long time, and you know, I don't really have a great excuse other than like last January when I was supposed to finish this video, the semester was ending for my school, and I got really just kind of busy with that and forgot about this video for a while, and then when I tried to come back to it, I had pretty rough writer's block, so it got to the point where I didn't finish the script until March, and then I spent the past month or so very slowly putting the video together, and so it should be coming out. It should be late April when this gets uploaded, but I want you guys to know I'm gonna try to get back on track with like regular uploads, like at least once a month. I want to make like these big documentary-ish video essay videos because I have so much fun putting them together. It was just kind of hard to write about like very long segments, basically just going over what happens because this is such a long story-based game. But I think you guys know what the next video is going to be. I'm going to be making the big Half-Life retrospective, which more talking about the gameplay, less major lore and story to go into other than, you know, stuff like the 7 Hours War and the backstory to, you know, Gordon Freeman. But that should be coming out next month, and I can't wait to get back in the swing of things with making videos regularly because this is a really fun hobby to have. I'm gonna be honest, I made YouTube videos back in elementary and middle school, but it's never been as fun as it is now. So I want you guys all to know that more stuff is coming, and if you're not really into, you know, JRPG Persona stuff, the next video is gonna be Half-Life, and I want to talk more about games like that I grew up with than games I played recently. But if you do like Mega 10 and Persona, I have been playing a lot of games in that franchise recently, so there will probably be more stuff related to that in the future as well, just not coming up immediately soon. So anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I can't wait to keep making more of this stuff, and I hope you guys like it, so have a great day. Thank you.